Once again, welcome everyone, familiar faces and new ones. I am Irini Allen. I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 US-based nonprofit dedicated to making the classics accessible to everyone who wants to learn about them. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Freddie Kimpton. Freddie was a journalist before moving into academia. He is a PhD almost to his viva, hopefully in January. On his way to a PhD at the University of Exeter, his thesis is on Ovid's representation of time in Metamorphoses, and he teaches Latin language and literature. So happy to have you here, Freddie. I'm going to just turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk. I'm looking at the names here, and there's some familiar faces actually that I wasn't quite expecting, which is an absolute delight. So I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. So my thesis is on time in the Metamorphoses, and this is sort of a little bit based on that, but sort of broadened out. It's also, the thesis also tries to look at ways in which poems like the Metamorphoses are still relevant in the present day, what they can tell us about important aspects of our life in the present day. So now what I'm going to try and do is do the classics. I'm going to try and share my screen. So if you bear with me for that, that involves a degree of technological ability, which I may not have. So here we go. Where's this screen share thing here? Here it is, right. Okay, that one there. Right. Okay, can everybody see my slides in play mode?
Yes.
Fantastic, excellent. Well, I'm already winning. Fantastic. All right, let's get going. So the title of the talk today is Ovid's Fictional Universe, World Building in the Metamorphoses. And before I start, I want to talk, I'm going to be using Stephanie McCarter's translation of the Metamorphoses. It's called Metamorphoses by Ovid. In the UK, it's published by Penguin. And so I would really recommend, if you want to read it, it's in paperback. It's a really, really good version. Once we get to the Q&A, I've got it right by my side. I'll show you a physical copy of it. Right, let's get started. So the Metamorphoses, written by the early imperial Roman author Publius Ovidius Naso, known to us in English as Ovid, consists of 15 books of some 700 to 800 lines, each of which describe miraculous transformations of mostly humans into other things, animals, plants, trees, features of the natural world, and even gods. While it is a mythographic text, a compendium of different myths, it is written in the hexameter of epic, and therefore aligns with an ancient literary tradition that encompasses, among other works, the Roman epic masterpiece by Virgil, the Aeneid, as well as the Iliad and Odyssey by Homer. The Metamorphoses is acutely aware of the tradition within which it works, yet it also strives to set itself apart from that tradition, as made clear by its introductory lines, which lay out the poet's intentions. And he begins as follows: "My spirit moves me to tell of shapes transformed into new bodies. Gods, inspire my work, for you've transformed it too, and from creation to my own time spin an unceasing song." In this proem, Ovid tells his audience that his own intellect has encouraged him to write of bodies changed into new forms in a continuous poem that will cover a vast expanse of time and space, from the creation of the universe to Ovid's own era, the early imperial period of the Emperor Augustus, under which he was writing. There is no traditional appeal to the muses for guidance, nor will Ovid begin in the midst of the action, as is customary in the epic tradition. The Iliad, for instance, covers a period of less than 50 days in a war that was supposed to have lasted 10 years. Instead, the ambition set out in these opening lines by Ovid is immense, resulting in a poem that takes pre-existing epic forms and uses them to create something totally new. The Metamorphoses is also, as one scholar rightly says, omnivorous in the way that it incorporates other genres and styles into its epic storytelling. It engages extensively with tragic themes, love elegy, hymnic poetry, and philosophical discourse across all 15 books, able to swallow up entire poems, such as the Aeneid and the Iliad, whose plots it summarizes, or better put, treats in its own distinct fashion. Scholars have consequently given all of the above, found it difficult to establish a clear spatio-temporal structure for the poem, a coherent chronological framework that explains the sequential order of events, with some arguing that the Metamorphoses operates outside the normal boundaries of time and space, creating a flattened world, which, as one scholar has suggested, is almost monodimensional in nature, where it is impossible to determine how individual episodes fit chronologically within the broader structure of the poem. This question has taken up a lot of scholarly time, with critics eventually settling on a vague progression which sees the Metamorphoses move from a time in which gods and humans were living in close proximity to one dominated by heroes, before ending in the era of datable human history with the arrival of the cult of Asclepius to Rome in 292 BCE, an episode described at length in Book 15, and the murder of Julius Caesar and his subsequent deification in 44 BCE. This has as its parallel a spatial journey from east to west, from Greece and the Near East to Italy and Rome. The task of identifying a clear chronological pattern to the Metamorphoses, establishing how exactly it moves in time and space from the creation of the universe to Augustan Rome, is further complicated by the various transitional devices Ovid deploys to link individual narratives. While there are many cases of direct causation that frame successive events, one event is caused by the outcome of the one that precedes it. Another favored technique involves a significant journey involving a god or heroic figure, while a number of transitions are framed by comparison and simultaneity, an event that takes place more or less at the same time as, or is thematically similar to, another otherwise unrelated event. And then there are the cases of authorial intervention, of which there are a large number, in which Ovid, as the poet-narrator, addresses a character within the story world of the Metamorphoses directly, via a rhetorical device called an apostrophe, as a means of linking stories. Many scholars have argued that there is a certain improvisational character to all these transitions, complicating the reader's understanding of time and space, even if they do provide the Metamorphoses with its unique sense of flow, ensuring it remains continuous until the end, as promised in its opening lines. And yet, there are a number of distinct thematic correspondences which do provide a certain chronological overlay to all of these disparate episodes. The first of these is linked with creation and beginnings, describing the inception of the cosmos, extending all the way to the midpoint of Book 2 and the death of Phaeton, who scorches the earth with fire as he tries to drive the chariots of his father, Phoebus, across the sky. Other identifiable clusters, as you can see from the slide, involve the city of Thebes, the hero Perseus, the sorceress Medea, King Minos of Crete, the Thracian poet Orpheus, the story of Troy, and Aeneas's migration to Italy, and finally, the city of Rome. Genealogy plays a crucial role in this regard, working in conjunction with the above thematic overlay to provide a non-numerical patterning of sorts, a navigation system which the reader can hold on to, although one which nonetheless can be difficult to discern at times. And this merely contributes to the unique nature of the Metamorphoses more broadly as an epic poem. For unlike the inherited tradition, there is no overarching story arc or plot to tie everything together. Whereas in other epic poems, the world building serves the broader story, here the world building is the story. This is further evidenced by the ideological quality of many of the episodes in the Metamorphoses, which are self-contained explanatory narratives with their own beginnings and endings. By these accounts of miraculous change, the Metamorphoses describes the origins of some of the natural phenomena, cultural practices that continue to exist in the poet's present day, certain behaviors of animals as well, such as the establishment, for instance, in terms of culture, of the Pythian games, or the origins of a rock that appears to weep real tears, or the reason why woodpeckers hammer their beaks against the trunks of trees. Thus, the Metamorphoses is a poem which describes a mythical historical world, which is very much in formation, as it hurtles forward in time and space from the inception of the universe to Augustan Rome. And this focus on the world itself and its structures is possibly the Metamorphoses' most important feature, as it allows Ovid to reflect at length on the nature of that world and the interactions between its inhabitants in ways that are still relevant and meaningful for us in the 21st century. So what sort of world is this? How is it meaningful in the way that I've just described? A starting point for a discussion of these important questions involves the first of two extended philosophical narratives that bookend the Metamorphoses. The first one describing the creation of the universe in Book 1. The very first word after the introduction is before, or ante in the Latin. The process of creation describes the transformation of matter from an inert state into the constituent parts of the world as we know it, by the separation of the four main elements: air, fire, water, and earth. Before the sea and land and vaulting sky, all nature looked the same throughout the world, nothing but sluggish weight and battling seeds of things just loosely joined in one big heap. We then have shown after this a phase-by-phase description of the physical composition of the world into recognizable features, using the language and ideas of ancient philosophy, and focusing very much on the world's spatial attributes rather than its temporal ones. However, having established the basic parameters of its world via these lines of philosophical discourse, the Metamorphoses abruptly transitions into a mythical passage on the metallic ages, the ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, charting humanity's fall from a state of grace. This is followed by a brief description of the giants' assault on Olympus, a story closely associated with the epic genre. A subsequent council of the Olympian gods, after Jupiter's elevated status is questioned by the Arcadian king Lycaon, then prepares the way for the destruction of the newly formed world by flood. A catastrophic event which is followed by the reconstitution of that world and the recreation of humanity via its sole survivors, Deucalion and Pyrrha, who throw stones over their shoulders that then become a new race of humans. After a brief interlude, a second cosmic destruction takes place in Book 2, this time by fire, thanks to Phaeton. Only then does the world of the poem take on a semblance of stability. The opening episodes of the Metamorphoses can therefore be read as constituting a chain of cycles, a repetition of cosmic destruction and renewal as the poem's dynamic force of recurring change makes its presence felt. What we have presented to us, therefore, is a world which is fundamentally fluid, governed by change, yet which is constantly seeking a more stable state. It is best described as a discordant harmony, and this is MacArthur's translation of the Latin Discors Concordia, which appears in Book 1, line 433. And this view of Ovid's poetic universe is reinforced by the speech given by the Greek philosopher Pythagoras in Book 15, the second philosophical section I talked about, which emphasizes the role change plays in shaping the underlying pillars that support that world. This includes both human existence more generally, given that Pythagoras describes how the souls of the dead leave their corpses and seek new bodies via a process of reincarnation called metempsychosis, as well as human notions of time, which he says is an aspect of change flowing continuously like a river, both always changing and yet always the same, And this slide has a little section there, which of the poem, which describes exactly this and how how time fits in with change. It is part of change. At this point, it is important to stress that one should not fall into the trap of thinking that these two manifestations of change, the underlying cosmic change that I've just talked about, and the episodes of miraculous transformation, are distinct from one another or totally unconnected. Transformation should be seen as an aspect of the poem's broader cosmology, a part of this phenomenon of universal flux, which allows for the metamorphosis of humans into new entities. While these are most often the outcomes of conflicting encounters, hold on, I've just lost my place here. While these are most often the outcomes of conflictive encounters which end up reaching unmanageable levels, such transformations are only ever possible because the world in which they take place is inherently unstable on an underlying level, driven by this other more fundamental cosmic change. These incidents of one-off metamorphoses are not therefore the preserve of the poem's many divinities, even though they are most often responsible directly or indirectly for their occurrence. Transformation is not reduced to some magic trick that only the gods can perform. To take the river metaphor a step further, it is as if the cosmic river of the metamorphosis is occasionally so disturbed by violent external forces that these then produce a massive surge in the natural flow of water. When these moments of maximum disruption happen, miraculous transformation is able to occur. The other important feature of this world created by Ovid is that it's as much artistic as it is natural, with the cosmogony serving as a metaphor for the artistic composition of the poem itself. And at the heart of this creative process, or at least the first stages of it, is a figure called the divine craftsman. And here I've got a couple of sections in which this person is discussed in the poem. In MacArthur's translation, a god and better nature, someone who is present at the beginning of the universe, yet who then disappears from view entirely. This individual, who is the guiding hand of the world of the poem, the world the poem constructs for us, is both drawn from the philosophical tradition, as outlined, for instance, in Plato's Timaeus, and also serves figuratively as a representation of the poet. The act of creation consequently becomes both an event of nature and an artistic process, creating a fictional setting for the storytelling that then takes place. Nature and art go hand in hand, and in some respects, art is seen as superseding nature in the prominence it is given. The complex relationship that exists between nature and art in the Metamorphoses underlines the broader point in relation to the poem, which is that it uses the figurative power of literature to reflect both on the cosmological structures which underpin its world and on itself as a work of artistic composition. To provide just a handful of examples, when the goddess Minerva challenges the upstart Arachne to a weaving contest in Book 6, the tapestry Arachne then produces, depicting the love affairs of the gods and the offspring that they then generate, represents a snapshot of the poem itself. The images on the tapestry are described using the vocabulary of rapid and tumultuous movement, an impossibility when one considers the static nature of pictures woven in fabric. And this mirrors the fluid nature of the main narrative as it moves from episode to episode with astonishing speed. Equally, in Book 15, in an encounter between Jupiter and his daughter Venus, the Metamorphoses references a set of tablets made out of bronze, iron, and adamant that reside in the dwelling of the three fates, which show every event in time, past, present, and future. In essence, all of time and space on one object. Again, the critics have identified this artifact as another figurative representation of the poem as a whole. And finally, in Book 8, there is a description of the labyrinth in Crete built to house the Minotaur and designed by the master craftsman Daedalus. The bewildering arrangements of corridors belonging to the labyrinth underscored by its comparison with the notoriously deceptive Meander River, appears to match Ovid's own structural arrangement of his poem, his ordering of episodes. McCarter's translation says, Daedalus, a craftsman famed for his brilliance, built this masterpiece with puzzling guideposts and a knot of tangled corridors that misled and deceived the eye. So Daedalus fills up these countless paths with so much error that he barely finds his own way out. The structure was that cunning. So too, Ovid, in his guide as a poet narrator, offers the reader a high-wire exploration of his own internal world of the Metamorphoses, able, like Daedalus, to access aspects of its time and space of his own choosing. Equally, the Metamorphoses is populated by a large number of artist figures, often suffering great violence at the hands of gods who are more powerful than them. This is a subject I'll talk about later. We not only have Arachne and Daedalus, but there are, among others, the daughters of Minyas who tell each other stories to pass the time in Book 4, the daughters of Piraeus and the Muses who engage in a storytelling contest in Book 5, Marsyas who challenges Apollo to a music contest in Book 6 and then is flayed alive, Orpheus in Book 10 who attempts to rescue his wife Eurydice from the underworld, and Pygmalion also in Book 10, who falls in love with a statue he himself has made and which takes on a human form thanks to the assistance of Venus. Of course, these complex and beautiful artifacts that are representative of the poem are also representative of the cosmological structures that underscore it. The tapestry woven by Arachne amplifies the fluid and changeable nature of the world Ovid constructs, dominated by pervasive change. Daedalus's labyrinth captures via its size the vastness of that world, and also its fluidity via its confusing arrangement of corridors. The tablets that reside in with the fates are also symbolic of the vastness of Ovid's world, displaying all of time and space contained within it, while the quality and the durability of its materials are indicative of the gods' permanence in that world relative to humans, for whom time is finite and fleeting. It is only via memory and storytelling. Around a third of the entire poem takes the form of stories told by people who inhabit Ovid's world, that the human characters can expand their narrow spatio-temporal horizons beyond the present of their immediate experience. All of this has implications for how we might read the poem's chronology. Returning to the opening of the Metamorphoses, as I pointed out earlier, the reader is presented with a series of episodes drawn from philosophy and myth that describe cycles of creation and destruction, seemingly both linear and cyclical all at once. But perhaps, rather than examining the sequence of stories as strictly linear or cyclical, one can say instead that the Metamorphoses begins by establishing a suite of possible futures for itself out of the many options available to it. These then help determine how we read the remainder of the poem, each one viewing the world that is being formed from different but overlapping angles. What these stories do is to suggest a range of entry points or doorways into the Metamorphoses' internal story world, the Daedalus-like labyrinth that Ovid creates for us, instead of offering a chronologically linear account of how that world began. What one needs to do, therefore, as a reader, is to separate the linear progression of the reading experience, the sequential order in which episodes appear in the text, from the chronological progression of events told in the story world. Stories may appear after other stories in the poem, but this does not necessarily mean that the events on which they are based occur after one another in time. And this is especially relevant for those linking devices that involve gods, who have the capacity to move back and forth in time and space at will. The ethereal manner of their movement and their speed are indicative of their superior ability to manipulate the cosmological structures of Ovid's world. And this is something that one must take into account when determining how episodes fit together from a chronological perspective. Now, this all connects with the other major question, the really important question, I think, that I'd like to address in this presentation, which relates to what goes on inside the world constructed by the Metamorphoses. How do the structures of that world help shape the conflicts that seem to dominate the poem? Conflicts between gods and humans, and among humans themselves, which in turn drive the accounts of transformation. To begin to answer this question, we should return to one of the episodes cited earlier, which describes how humanity began by living in a golden age paradise of plenty, a time that enjoyed an eternal spring, before humans' increasingly depraved behavior resulted in a descent through subsequent ages until they reached the age of iron. The Metallic Ages story in Book 1 is the one segment of the Metamorphoses where the arrow of time is at its most visible, underpinned by this disintegration of moral standards. And as you can see here, it says the Golden Age came first, not forced by law. Its people freely honored loyalty and right. Then, with Saturn tossed to murky Tartarus, Jove's rule began. Then came the silver race, worth less than gold, but more than tawny bronze. The chronological hierarchy of each age is plainly signposted. Gold is marked out as a first, with silver taking place after the thronement of Saturn. It is during this age that time is first mentioned, as Jupiter divides up this perpetual spring into proper seasons, forcing humans to shelter in houses and undertake agriculture in order to survive. Bronze is indicated as the third age after silver, as you can see from the next slide. And finally, iron, flagged as the very last of the four ages. Then came hardy iron, Ovid writes, at once into this age of lesser metal, all crime burst forth as shame, integrity, and trust took flight. This age is the most depraved of all, characterized by a collapse in trust among families, a propensity for warfare, and an excessive desire for wealth. Critics have rightly, I think, identified this section as a veiled commentary on Rome's civil war period at the end of the Republic, which was marked by all of these features and more. As I indicated earlier, the main narrative then abruptly transitions to an account of Jupiter's devastation of the ordered world in the form of the Great Flood, and then its restitution once those waters recede. But the question is left hanging in the air. What sort of world does Ovid describe after the Great Flood? Is it one that conforms to a new age of gold, or is it one that is a continuation of the age of iron? Or is it perhaps something in between? In one sense, the proximity displayed by gods and humans in the early books of the Metamorphoses is suggestive of a Golden Age world, as such proximity is considered a basic feature of that age in the literary tradition. But this is clearly untenable as an argument, given the conflict that exists between the two sides from the very beginning. And so critics have argued that Ovid's world post-flood is either an extension of the Age of Iron, or a world which telescopes all of these ages into one. It becomes a dystopian place driven by extreme violence and the emotional trauma that this then produces. For the world of the Metamorphoses is very much characterized by anger, divine anger specifically, as well as a contestation of individual divinities by those mortals who dare to stand up to them. Jupiter's anger, or ira in the Latin, is first cited in Book 1, when the ruler of the gods seethes at the perceived wickedness of the world that has just been created, and the challenge to his authority posed by Lycaon. And it also takes center stage in the Metamorphoses' final lines. Ovid describes how neither fire nor iron, the ravages of old age, nor Jupiter's anger, Jovis ira, will destroy the poem he has just written, with Jupiter in this instance widely assumed to refer to Augustus in the context of Ovid's banishment from Rome, a subject I shall return to later. Numerous episodes underscore this recurring theme of anger. Juno exacts a terrible punishment on Lycaon's daughter Callisto, turning her into a bear after she has been raped by her husband Jupiter. Mercury turns the Athenian princess Aglaris, who stands in his way as he attempts to seduce her sister, into stone. Diana transforms Actaeon into a stag, who is then killed by his own hounds after he accidentally sees her naked. Bacchus has the king of thieves Pentheus torn into pieces by members of his own family who are overtaken by a Bacchic frenzy after Pentheus refuses to accept his divinity. Apollo and Diana murder all 14 of Niobe's children after she presumes to be of a higher status than their mother Latona. Overcome by grief, Niobe turns into a rock that appears to weep real tears. These are just some of the many examples of divine rage that frame this poem. I could go on. Time and space, the basic pillars that underscore Ovid's worlds, are very much part of this dynamic, serving as a physical and thematic locus for acts of terrible violence and the questioning of the divine. For example, when Callisto is transformed into a bear by a jealous Juno, she retains her former mental capacities, and as a human trapped inside the body of an animal, she struggles to come to terms with her new form. Her human understanding of time and space remains in direct conflict with her physical shape. As a bear, her behavior conforms to that of a human, reaching a paradoxical climax when the narrator observes, playing on Callisto's former status as a hunting partner of Diana, how many times she was pursued on cliffs by barking dogs. The huntress fled in fear of hunters. Callisto even hides from other wild beasts, although she is a bear, and is terrified of her own species, forgetful of what she herself has become. And when she accidentally, as a bear, encounters her son Jupiter, Arcas, who is unwittingly about to transfix her with a spear, Jupiter transforms them urgently into constellations, the Great Bear and the Bear Ward. This then leaves her in yet another completely different relationship with time and space altogether, becoming part of the celestial world of stars. Callisto's story conforms with one of the guiding principles of transformation in the Metamorphoses, that as Jupiter indicates in relation to her father Lycaon in Book 1, a residual element of the original human remains in the transformed entity. Lycaon's own transformation into a bloodthirsty and predatory wolf closely aligns with his murderous nature he displayed when he was a human. And you can see it in these lines here. Aghast, he flees into the silent fields, trying in vain to speak. He howls, his mouth derives its rage from him. Craving the slaughter to which he is accustomed, he attacks the sheep. Now too he takes his joy in blood, his clothes transform to fur, his arms to leg, and though he becomes a wolf, he keeps some traces of his past form. Other transformations follow Callisto's template. Another of Jupiter's victims, Io, who is transformed into a cow by Jupiter to hide her from Juno, is also described as a human trapped in the body of an animal, as is Actaeon, who Diana turns into a stag. But at the other end of the spectrum, however, this residue that we talk about here, he keeps some traces of his past form, refer to a superficial external feature only, such as Niobe's tears or the peculiar sound of the panpipes, which were formerly syrinx, or to certain types of behavior, the nocturnal preferences of bats, who were once the daughters of Minyas, that appear to echo an aspect of the individuals before they changed. Then there are those characters such as the Nymphiane, who experience metamorphosis, becoming a pool of water, as a form of death. Her sanctuary is defiled when Pluto blasts a hole in it to return to the underworld with his abducted bride Persephone. The assumption here is that the former person does not survive their transformation in any meaningful way. This all then raises important questions in relation to personal identity and the continuity of a person over time in the face of dramatic and unexpected change. For example, in Book 10, a pregnant mirror becomes a tree, yet then gives birth to Adonis in a procedure that approximates a human caesarean section. She groans with excruciating pain and sheds emotional tears as a human would do. But there is no subsequent event, either another transformation or the person's death, that can resolve this contradiction. So the question is left hanging in the air. What is mirror exactly? To what extent is she a human, and to what extent is she a tree? Then there is the issue of the princess who becomes a crow in book 2. She tells her own story as a human would tell that story, yet she is a crow. Now, this conundrum might be resolved by accepting that the princess is a comic creation with little or no depth to her, simply existing to recount an amusing tale. But there is also the possibility that the princess is yet another human who's found themselves imprisoned inside the body of an animal. The reader cannot say for sure because Ovid does not, unlike with Callisto or Io or Actaeon, give us any clear insight into their mental states. What is certain is that when a person is transformed into another entity, their relationship with the natural world changes fundamentally. Returning to Lycaon, as we see in this slide, he experiences a complete temporal, spatial, and cultural breakdown, shifting from a human who is governed by diurnal temporal patterns to a nocturnal predator. This is both a major change with respect to Lycaon's engagement with time and space, and another feature of the continuity that pervades this particular episode, given that he plots to murder Jupiter at night. His new abode, the silent wilderness of the surrounding countryside versus the Arcadian palace, represents a symbol of his isolation from society, and this is amplified by his loss of clothes, which turn into fur. He loses his human physical form and is at the same time dehumanized culturally. Equally, when the daughters of Minyas are transformed into bats by Bacchus in Book 4, they collectively suffer a similar sudden reversal of biorhythmic patterns, becoming nighttime rather than daytime creatures, which operate in the dark through sound and echo rather than sight. Those individuals who become trees or plants, meanwhile, see their spatial horizons shrink to the place where they find themselves, literally rooted to the spot. And I think here we have Daphne, for instance. Help, Father, she says. If these streams of yours are holy, destroy what makes me pleasing, change my form. Her prayers just spoken, dull weight grabs her limbs, a slender bark enfolds her supple torso. Her hair sprouts up as leaves, her arms as branches. A stiff root clasps her foot, just now so swift. The treetop takes her mouth, just as her gleam remains. In contrast, the temporal horizons of these same characters expand well beyond those of humans as they become part of the physical landscape, suddenly susceptible to seasonal change. Moreover, the way some trees are used to commemorate events, for example, Cyparissus, who becomes a cypress that over time will be associated with mourning, is suggestive of a continuity or persistence of the transformed individual over many centuries because of the powerful regenerative rhythms of flora more broadly. And when it comes to humans who turn into features of a landscape, such as Niobe, who becomes a weeping rock, in Book 6, as you can see from this slide, these individuals move from human time to a form of timeless stasis, or the vastness of geological time, which, as Seyane, who melts into a pool of water, often serves as both a metaphor and a replacement for the person's actual death. And Ovid describes Niobe's situation as follows. Bereft, she stiffened in her woe, her hair unmoving in the breeze, her face now bloodless, her eyes stare motionless in her sad face, no life is visible. Her tongue and throat grow hard inside her, and her veins stop drumming. But still she wept. A whirlwind snatched her off, back to her homeland. On its peak she melts away. Still now the marble drips with tears. As indicated before, such changes are often driven by divine anger, but the gods are not always in control of this process. Daphne turns into a laurel tree after appealing to her father Peneus in order to escape from Apollo's clutches, while grief and certain other emotional responses such as shame are as much their own motivating factors for metamorphosis as is rage. And Niobe is an example of this. She turns into a mountain peak because she is grieving so much for the loss of her sons and daughters. For Lycaon, his metamorphosis into a wolf is both a function of Jupiter's rage and of the king's own response to that rage, his terror, teditus in the original Latin. At no point does the narrative mark out Jupiter as the direct cause of the transformation by the words he says or some other ritual action, even though this may have been his intention. Of course, metamorphoses can also be seen as a reward, as the example of Philemon and Baucis shows in Book 8, when at the end of their natural lives they become trees with intertwining trunks, having previously generously hosted Jupiter and Mercury in their own modest home. The second half of Ovid's poem comes to be dominated by this type of change as reward, sanctioned apotheoses of selected individuals, Hercules, Aeneas, Romulus, which culminates in the deification of Julius Caesar in Book 15. Above all, the act of transformation, as we can see from these examples, is itself shown to be an unstable phenomenon, defying categorization, evolving and changing as the poem proceeds. And via these repeated instances of change, it poses a series of questions which sit at the heart of the fictional world it constructs of us, for us. These are centered on what it means to be human, the complications that come with that, and especially how we as humans should see ourselves in relation to the world in which we live. And these are questions that I believe are as relevant in the present day as they were when Ovid was writing. Take, for instance, the daughters of Minyas again. When they are turned into bats, the shrill noises that they then make, these complicated sounds which bats use to locate themselves in time and space, are described as an inadequate or substandard mode of human communication. When they try to speak, Ovid writes, their tiny bodies send out tiny voices, a dirge they utter in thin squeaks. On one level, the anthropomorphized sounds so described can be treated as evidence of the residual humanity that survives metamorphosis. On another level, we have an attempt to make sense of animal behavior by treating it as an inferior version of its human equivalent, admittedly from the perspective of an ancient author who may not have known about the full complexity of echolocation. We are unable to accurately determine the extent to which the metamorphosed sisters have retained some of their former human state, because we have, or are given, no insight into their thoughts. Nor can we, on a more general level, qualitatively measure the conscious experience of bats and compare it with our own, for exactly the same reason. What we can say is that both humans and bats communicate in especially complex ways, which have important implications for their own survival. And this is a major element of their respective behaviors, which unites them. Another example involves Arachne in Book 6, who is turned into a spider. As with other transformations, Arachne's sense of time and place is completely overturned by the process of metamorphosis. Spatially, she is restricted by the webs she creates, while the passage implies an endless repetition through her weaving. Arachne's metamorphosis is one of the clearest examples of how change strips away an individual's humanity, both physically and figuratively. Her hair, nose, and ears simply fall off, while her head contracts to a much smaller size. The residual continuity in this transformation resides in the slender silk Arachne produces as a spider. It's a symbol of both her former activity as a weaver and the noose she prepares for herself before Minerva decides to change her. She had anticipated committing suicide when she discovers who she was competing against. It also symbolizes the thread, the fragile nature of the art that she produces. Just as Minerva tears apart her tapestry when Arachne was human, so the webs she makes as a spider face a similar fate. One critic describes it as follows: Arachne becomes a spider perpetually weaving a web destined always to be destroyed. She is endlessly repeating an action of no consequence. However, one can argue against this view, especially as the Ovidian text itself does not say that the webs created by Arachne as a spider are in any way worthless. Spiders' webs are in reality highly complex spatial structures essential for the spider to survive over time. one can read in the story of Arachne an implicit criticism of human behavior and its assumed superiority over other animals. We destroy spiders' webs with the same arrogant ease and indifference with which Minerva destroyed Arachne's artwork, because we wrongly perceive them to be insignificant, worse than us when they are not. Arachne's metamorphosis may have changed her physically in fundamental aspects, but we should not assume that her new incarnation is inherently inferior to her previous human form. In many instances, metamorphosis occurs when continuing to live as humans becomes untenable. See, for instance, Tereus, Philomela, and Procne in Book 6, or Sakes and Alcyone in Book 11, all of whom turn into birds of various sorts. Metamorphosis offers an opportunity to continue existing in ways that are superior to a human life, as it was being lived precisely before the change. Conversely, for others, metamorphosis prolongs their lives when they actively desire death, becoming a form of torture almost, as is the case with Cyparissus in Book 10 or Aeschylus in Book 11. If there is one thing we can say about the Metamorphoses, is that it never provides us with easy answers. The same question is also relevant when we consider humans in relation to the gods, especially if we see the latter as superhuman constructs that act as mirrors against which we might judge ourselves. Their existence may seem on the surface to be far superior to those of mortals in all sorts of ways, especially via the longevity and invulnerability that they enjoy compared with humans. I mean, who wouldn't want that? But one might also argue that their divine status becomes a much less attractive proposition, precisely because there is no actual finality to the god's existence. It stretches out almost interminably until the universe itself ends. The suffering that the Ovidian gods cause their human victims can be read as an indirect result of the boredom they feel, becoming almost a pathological response to the tedium of a mortal life. In contrast, the value of a mortal life may stem from it being seen as both uncertain and finite, which makes the moments that are lived so unique. Without these, the joy is sucked out of living. Imagine, for instance, having access to an object along the lines of the tablets of the fates that tells you everything that is going to happen in your own and everybody else's future. Is that something you really want to have at your disposal? Our lack of precognition is above all a coping mechanism. We wouldn't be able to survive being alive without it. Equally, the imperfect nature of memory is also crucial. Our ability to forget is central to making our lives viable as we look forwards to the future. And this is a question which frames Aeneas's encounter with the Sibyl of Cumae, the legendary seer in Book 14. After the Sibyl successfully navigates Aeneas through the underworld, the Trojan hero promises to worship her as a god. But she rejects his acknowledgement of her divine status, arguing that she does not deserve the honor of veneration. The Sibyl tells Aeneas that Apollo had once promised her whatever gift she wanted, and that she had responded by saying she would like to live for as many years as there were grains in a nearby pile of sand, 1,000 in total. Apollo then said that he would also give her eternal youth to accompany her extraordinary long life as long as she slept with him. But the Sibyl was young at the time and so declined this offer, condemning herself to a quasi-eternal life that will still see her age. One day, she says, extended time will shrink my body, my limbs will shrivel, wasted by old age down to a tiny weight. She will become so old, she admits, that Apollo will deny that he even desired her, or perhaps not even recognize her at all. She will be reduced only to a voice, the one thing that the fates will have left her with. In this episode, the Sibyl describes how she's forced to live out a conflict of incompatible temporalities. This massively extended lifespan afforded to those who are divine against the natural aging process that accompanies a mortal existence. The Sibyl will see her body gradually disintegrate into nothing, leaving only her residual divinity, her prophetic voice. In many respects, this is as monstrous as Apollo's flaying of Marsyas's body, in the suffering and misery that it will cause her, which, thanks to her clairvoyance, she can already foresee. So to end, I want to talk about two things. First, I want to briefly discuss the final lines of the Metamorphoses, in which Ovid defends both his poem and his status as a poet, predicting a future which will see him both endure in the face, which will see both endure in the face of whatever misfortunes are thrown at them. This epitaph is especially poignant if one accepts, as most scholars do, that it was written and then added on to the pre-existing text from exile. Ovid was banished from Rome, as you may know, his physical and intellectual home, and sent to Tomis on the Black Sea, modern-day Romania, in 8 CE by the Emperor Augustus, who is closely associated with Jupiter in the poem, for a complex set of reasons which I won't go into here. Despite his best efforts, Ovid was never able to return or reverse his punishment. Tomis became a place of great suffering for him, and he died there in 18 CE. There are many ways to read the Metamorphoses in terms of its tone. It was for a time seen as solely as light-hearted or playful, the product of Ovid's legendary detached irony, and therefore a little shallow, all surface, although this is no longer a critical view that gains much traction. There is, it is fair to say, a reason why Ovid's imaginary world is populated by so many artist figures who suffer terribly at the hands of the gods, like he did. As seen through this lens of exile, I find it impossible not to view the Metamorphoses as a condemnation of power. The way in which excessive and extreme power can destroy the lives of the powerless utterly, in brutal and demeaning ways. This is a reality which is sadly all too relevant in a present-day context, and when I read this poem, I imagine that I'm hearing above all the voices of the many victims, and through them, the voice of Ovid himself. The truth is that I've only really touched the surface of this epic poem, having briefly discussed the way in which Ovid constructs his fictional world, as well as aspects of how that world operates, and the type of questions it poses about the nature and value of human life. Above all, by these 250-odd stories of miraculous transformation, the Metamorphoses provides us with a kaleidoscope of human and other perspectives, subjective views of the world which together are able to capture some of the totality of human experience. Not only that, but it does this in ways that are still meaningful for how we live our lives now in the 21st century, which is what makes it such an extraordinary work of literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly thought-provoking and so many different connections to Homer that I'm making in my head, and divergences and intersections. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we'll be able to have a little discussion. Yeah, I agree, Andy. Brilliant. So thank you again, Freddie, and everybody hold on one second.